You wake up inside a stranger's palace. Golden robes hang on the walls. Incense drifts through the halls. A king calls you an honored guest and treats you like family. And you already know something nobody has said out loud yet. You are never going home. Not to Portugal, not to your wife, not to a single person who still remembers your face. In 1487, this was not a nightmare. This was the reward for succeeding. For 300 years before you were born, Europe had been chasing a rumor. Somewhere past the edge of every known map, a Christian king was supposed to be ruling a kingdom richer than any popes, more powerful than any emperors, just waiting to be found. Every generation added a new detail to the story. Every generation sent someone east to look. You are simply the one who finally arrives. Rewind first. How does a rumor survive 3 centuries without anyone ever proving it? It starts with a German bishop named Otto of Freising. Around the year 1145, he wrote down a story he had heard secondhand about a Christian king named John, somewhere beyond Persia, who had crushed a Muslim army and was preparing to march toward Jerusalem. Nobody could confirm it. Nobody could locate him on a map. But the timing made it irresistible. The Crusaders' stronghold of Edessa had just fallen, and Europe was desperate for an ally who was not itself. 20 years of near silence followed. Then, in 1165, a letter surfaced. It was supposedly written by Prester John in person. Prester simply meaning elder, a term for a Christian priest who was also a king. Copies reached Manuel I, the Byzantine emperor. Copies reached Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor. And the letter did not undersell itself for a moment. Prester John claimed 72 kingdoms paid him tribute. His scepter was carved from a single emerald. He ate from tables made of amethyst. Somewhere inside his borders sat the Tower of Babel, the fountain of youth, and the earthly paradise itself, the source of the 4 rivers described in the book of Genesis. Was any single word of it true? It did not matter. Europe needed it to be true, and needed it badly. The historian Robert Silverberg, who spent years tracing the letter through European archives, found more than 100 separate copies and versions circulating for centuries afterward. In modern terms, this was one of the most successful forgeries ever produced. Pope Alexander III took it seriously enough to act on it directly. In 1177, he sent his own physician, a man named Philip, eastward with a formal written reply addressed to Prester John himself. Philip never appears in the historical record again, not once. No ship log, no burial record, no final letter home. A pope believed this forged letter enough to send his own personal physician across thousands of miles of hostile territory, chasing an address that did not exist, and the man simply stops appearing in any document anyone has ever found. Silence, exactly where a name should be. How many other messengers vanished the same way, swallowed whole by distance, long before anyone thought their stories were worth writing down? So the letter was almost certainly fake, written by someone who never set foot near a real Christian throne. But here's the part nobody in 1165 could have predicted. Underneath the fantasy, there actually was a Christian kingdom out there. It simply was not where anyone was looking, and it looked nothing like the letter had promised. For 2 centuries, Europe searched east, toward India, toward the grasslands where the Mongol Empire was rising. Rumors spread of a warrior prince called King David, said to be Prester John's own descendant, smashing Muslim armies in Persia. Exciting news, wasn't it? Except that prince turned out to be a general serving Genghis Khan. Wrong direction, wrong religion, wrong story completely. Then, in the 1300s, the map quietly shifted again. New reports reached European courts, describing an isolated African kingdom, sealed off from the Islamic world by mountains and desert, that had somehow stayed Christian for over 1,000 years, without anyone in the West even noticing. Its name was Ethiopia. This is where your story actually begins. By 1487, King John II of Portugal was finished waiting on rumors. He sent 2 men east on parallel missions. Afonso de Paiva was ordered straight toward Ethiopia. You, Pero da Covilla, were ordered to gather everything else first: the spice markets, the trade routes, the sailing seasons of the Indian Ocean that no Portuguese ship had yet crossed. You traveled disguised as a merchant. You bought honey in Rhodes to sell farther along the route. Cover story enough to move through Alexandria without drawing suspicion. A fever nearly killed you there before your mission had even properly started. By the time you and Paiva reached Cairo, the plan looked simple on paper. Split up, cover more ground, meet back in Cairo once it was done. You sailed on toward India. Paiva crossed the Red Sea toward Ethiopia. Neither of you understood yet how permanent that split was about to become. You did exactly what you were sent to do. You crossed to the Indian port of Calicut, disguised as an Arab trader, listening to merchants discuss cinnamon, pepper, and the monsoon winds that decided when ships could sail at all. You mapped the ports along the Indian coast. You gathered everything Portugal needed to know about the spice trade before a single Portuguese ship had made that crossing. This was years before Vasco da Gama would use exactly this information to open the sea route Portugal had been chasing for a generation. Then you returned to Cairo to hand over everything you had learned, and by every reasonable account, that should have been where your mission ended. It did not end there. Paiva was already dead. Nobody remained to finish the Ethiopian half of the assignment. So you went yourself, crossing the Red Sea alone, climbing through the Sinai, moving south into a country that, as far as most of Europe still believed, existed only inside a myth. What you found there was real, and that alone should have been the miracle. Ethiopia was genuinely Christian, and had been for over 1,000 years, an isolated highland kingdom, sealed off on nearly every side by Muslim states that had cut it off from the rest of Christendom for generations. But hold the letter's promises up against what actually stood in front of you. There was no emerald scepter, only an emperor's plain wooden staff. There was no table of amethyst, only stone halls and modest feasts. There was no fountain of youth, no Tower of Babel rising out of the hills, nothing that matched the fantasy you had been raised on since childhood. What waited instead was smaller, older, and stranger than any of it. A real Christian court that had simply survived, quietly, for centuries, while Europe spent 300 years imagining something far grander in its place. And there was a real emperor, named Eskender, who received you with real honor. He also would not let you leave. Notice what actually held you there. The letter had promised chains of gold and thrones built from jewels. What kept you in Ethiopia had no chains in it at all. Why keep a foreign traveler forever, instead of simply sending him home with the answer Europe had wanted for 300 years? Ethiopian emperors had a long, practical habit of retaining skilled foreign visitors permanently at court, treating their knowledge as too valuable to ever release back into the world. Nobody locked a door. Nobody posted a guard outside your window. You had simply stopped being a guest and become an asset, and assets, however kindly treated, do not get sent home. So you stayed. You built a life inside a court that had genuinely, quietly solved the mystery of Prester John, and for years, you may have been the only European alive who actually knew it. 30 long years passed. Then, in 1520, a Portuguese embassy finally reached that same court, and among them was a chaplain named Francisco Alvarez, whose written account later preserved your entire story for history. You wept openly when you saw them, 40 years since you had left home, and here, finally, were people who spoke your own language back to you. The emperor still refused to let you go. Here's the part that should reframe everything you thought this story was about. Europe spent 300 years imagining Prester John as a solution, a weapon, an ally who would finally tip the balance against Islam once and for all. What Europe eventually found instead was a real kingdom that needed nothing from them, wanted nothing from them, and simply absorbed the one man clever enough to actually reach it. The myth had promised power. The reality delivered belonging, permanent and completely inescapable. Is that really so different from how discovery still works today? People still chase the version of a place, a job, a relationship, a country that they built up long before they ever arrived. Someone moves across the world for a city they only knew from photographs. Someone takes a job they only knew from a job posting. And it rarely matches the legend, does it? What is usually waiting instead is smaller, stranger, and far more binding than the fantasy ever was. Because real things, unlike rumors, come with roots, obligations, and people who expect you to stay. You woke up once in a stranger's palace, certain you would never see home again. By the time you died in that same court decades later, you had long since stopped counting it as a sentence. Prester John's kingdom had been real all along. It simply was not looking for you. You were the one who never stopped looking for it. And in the end, it kept you.